So, le premier panel de ce matin, grandement attendu par un grand nombre d'entre nous. En fait, l'intérêt était tellement grand qu'on a organisé un dîner hier soir à ce sujet. Si je comprends bien, ça a été un grand succès, alors contente pour ça. Le titre du panel est « Le défi de l'innovation dans la fonction publique ». L'organisatrice est Amanda Clark, une ancienne boursière Trudeau. Amanda est chargée d'enseignement à la School of Public Policy and Administration de l'Université de Carleton. Elle enseigne l'administration publique et ses recherches portent sur le gouvernement à l'ère numérique, les réformes du secteur public et les nouveaux modèles de l'engagement civique. The Trudeau scholars have been very respectful so far in leaving the mics to other people to ask questions, but this is the last day, so no more respect is due. We want to see these Trudeau scholars grilling these experts that we brought to you from Finland, Denmark, New York, Toronto. So now's your time to shine. Please go ahead, Amanda.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I just wanted to welcome everybody here. Bienvenue. I think we're going to have a really great conversation, and it's good to see that so many people have showed up on a Saturday morning to talk about public service reform. In discussing the extent to which our institutions are up for today's big challenges, the theme of this conference, the stakes are perhaps nowhere higher than in government. Despite the move to more systems-based or collaborative models of social problem solving, ones that typically rely on non-government actors and that our opening speaker, Indy Johar, referred to, it remains that the public service is still a key actor in the provision of core public services and in guaranteeing our social welfare and our social safety net. So this matters. It really does matter. The public service is an institution with which citizens interact daily in using public services. And in fact, every act that you take, from the toothbrush you use in the morning to the roads you drive on to get to work, the schools you drop your kids off to, and the workplace you attend, is intimately affected by the activities of public servants across the country and here in Ottawa. It's the regulations, laws, and programs that they implement and services that they deliver that really shape the quality of life in Canada. And perhaps most importantly, it is the nonpartisan, evidence-based advice that they provide our elected decision makers that determine the quality of our policies, assuming the Prime Minister is actually interested in listening to the public service. In any case, there's no denying that the public service continues to be central to our collective well-being. However, and this is what brings us here today, many have been seriously questioning whether or not our public service is up to meet today's big challenges. We regularly read about large and costly program failures. We complain about services that just don't seem to be keeping pace with what we're seeing in the voluntary sector or in the private sector. The public service has faced regular and often completely haphazard cuts to its capacity following the rise of neoliberal governments, and in particular in the wake of the financial crisis. Despite a recognition that policy problems cut across boundaries and that information hoarding benefits no one, government organizations still tend to default to very siloed approaches, operating without coordination internally and very often being incapable of collaborating effectively with those outside their boundaries. Often bogged down by the stereotypical sort of red tape and hierarchy of government organizations. Governments have, not always, but in many cases, proven infamously slow, sclerotic, unable to adapt to trends and opportunities that we see other sectors and other actors embracing. And in a digital age, these trends and opportunities are coming at a lightning speed, rendering governments ever more out of touch and ever more behind the times. A public servant in Ottawa once told me that going to work every day feels like entering a time warp. And it is a time warp in many respects. Many public servants work on technology that is years out of date. They operate in an internet environment that exists behind a security firewall, denying them access to websites that citizens interact with daily and social networks that are rich with information relevant to their work. Public servants, at least in the Westminster system, are supposed to remain anonymous, faceless. Yet we live in an age where our lives are ever more digital, social, connected, and highly public. Even my mom is on Facebook when she can remember her password. But the public servants that serve her are not on Facebook, or at least shouldn't be. Maybe that will change. Finally, a number of scholars and public servants themselves have argued in recent years that our public service has the sort of nonpartisan evidence-based policy advisory role of our public service, arguably its most important role, has been eroded by political leaders that simply ignore the public service, or worse, turn them into a partisan political tool to further their electoral advantage next time we hit the polls. So, in this context, public sector innovation has become a very hot topic. This is the supposed saving grace for our public services. We see innovation labs, innovation agendas, innovation officers, innovation hubs. We talk about government 2.0, open source government, government as a platform, agile government, citizen engagement and co-production. Here in Ottawa, we have a cross-government engagement effort focused on sort of investing in our public service and making more open and networked through an agenda called Blueprint 2020. The Privy Council Office has an innovation hub, as do a number of departments. We're turning to international experts, two of whom are actually on our panel now, who've been meeting with our federal officials in Ottawa to teach them about new ways of thinking about policy and service that depart from well-worn but ultimately ineffective and often highly costly ways of solving social problems and delivering services. And of course, the big elephant in the room, there is huge buzz right now in Ottawa with a new government that has brought an atmosphere of hope and optimism to a public service whose morale has hit all-time lows in recent years. And there's a sense that, at least in rhetoric and in promise and in some key actions, we now have a government that genuinely wants to work with the public service to effect social change. I encourage you all to check out the mandate letters of our ministers, which were made open just yesterday. The pages are littered with the words open, innovation, evidence, and even failure. Yes, our ministers have been told that it is okay to fail. For public servants, it's like Christmas has come early. So this brings me to our conversation this morning, which is incredibly topical and incredibly timely. Now, like I said, you've got yourselves out of bed on a beautiful Saturday morning to come sit here and talk about a subject that I am fascinated by, but that maybe doesn't move citizens on a daily basis. And hopefully we can start to change that by realizing just how important the public service is today. But I also know that there are a lot of public servants in this room, and I wanted to get a sense of that. So I'd encourage you now, if you are a current or former public servant at any level of government, in any context, please stand right now. Stand, yeah, get up, let's do this. So we are in Ottawa, and you know, which is why this is a perfect place to, and let's give them come on, let's do it. Now, there were a lot of young faces out there. Maybe just maybe raise your hand if you joined the public service in the last 5 years. So good. Okay, so these are the leaders of the future who are going to have to take this institution that I have just explained is essentially broken and that we are going to try and fix. So this conversation is really about you and your work and what you're going to continue to be working on in the years ahead. But we also have an incredible amount of corporate history here with the number of current and former deputy ministers that I see in the room. And so we're going to do things a little bit differently this morning. We're going to have time to talk to our expert panelists, but then I want to open it up to you. This room is structured for a conversation, much better than the ones yesterday, and like we saw from everyone standing, there are a lot of you who have skin in the game here. So really, we need to get your questions. Scholars, I challenge you as well to live up to the irreverence that we're supposed to bring to the table here. So ask us the tough questions, and let's make this a fruitful use of your Saturday morning. So, let's get started and introduce our panelists. We have an incredible amount of expertise here today, and I really want to make the most out of it. So I'll begin by introducing our three experts, starting with Mark Jarvis. Mark Jarvis is practice lead for government transformation at the Mowat Center and co-author of the book that got the shout out yesterday, Democratizing the Constitution, Reforming Responsible Government, which was awarded the Donner Prize for Best Public Policy Book by a Canadian and the 2012 Donald Smiley Prize for Best Book relating to the study of government and politics in Canada. With his colleagues at the Mowat Center, Mark is currently completing a report exploring international trends in public service transformation, which is due out this year. Today, he serves as our resident Canadian, bringing an acute appreciation of the Canadian government, the pressures it's been facing, the opportunities that stand ahead of it, and the broader landscape of Canadian politics to the conversation this morning. Now, our two other panelists bring to the conversation an appreciation for cutting-edge approaches to public service delivery and policy design from abroad. Joining us from Denmark via New York, where she is currently visiting scholar with Parsons, the New School for Design, Kit Lykketoft is Deputy Director of the Mind Lab, a cross-government innovation unit in Denmark and the longest-living public sector innovation lab globally. Kit brings to this work a unique perspective born of her training as historian and anthropologist, and with her team at Mind Lab engages in unique methods of problem solving with public servants, such as prototyping and scenario building, most recently applied in one case working with elementary school teachers who facing an ambitious reform, which would essentially mean they had to teach much longer and have fewer hours for prep, a very current and topical issue in Canada now, as teachers that were recently on strike will tell you, or rather in work to rule. Let's be clear about what was going on. In any case, through Mind Lab, work collaboratively with teachers to come up with innovative ways and to more efficiently prep for teaching, so that the kind of quality time trade-off wouldn't be as severe. Now, next to Kit, joining us from London, and perhaps appropriately for today's discussion, bringing a perspective from a place where the Canadian Public Service first looked for sort of a model when building its public service. Dr. Tina Leakey is an advisor at the Behavioural Insights team, which, as I say, is a UK-based organization, a social purpose company that applies behavioural insights to public policy. Previously, Tina taught public opinion research and the psychology of social justice at the University of Lausanne. Through her work with the Behavioral Insights team, Dr. Leakey designs and executes randomized controlled trials to determine how things like social norms and peer pressure can compel citizens to pay their taxes on time, or do other behaviors that are, generally good for society as a whole. For example, with a simple change of wording to a tax form, she finds ways to save the UK state millions of pounds. And this approach is really on the cutting edge of policy innovation, so we're lucky to have her here with us today. Okay, so I'm going to have a seat now, and you'll be able to see me when I step away from this thing. And we'll get started. Okay, so to begin, what's wrong with the public service? There's more. Or traditionally, how the public service is operated. Essentially, why are we here today? And in particular, why have the three of you decided to dedicate your career? You're all very impressive. You could do lots of things. I'm sure McKinsey would love to snap you up if they could have you. But why are you working in the organizations you do, and why is your career dedicated to improving how the public service works? And maybe in answering that question, in particular for Kit and Tina, it would be useful to, say, give an example of the kinds of things you've done to help public services work more effectively. So maybe I'll begin with Mark to my immediate left, and then we'll move down the line. I think, do you not have a mic?
I think civil service organizations, like all organizations, face an array of challenges on an ongoing basis. But let me tell you what I think are probably the three biggest challenges that I see the civil service facing today in Canada. The first is what I would describe as a lack of shared understanding of what the role of the civil service is, what it's really for. We've got very limited discourse about the civil service. It's most often focused on mistakes when things go wrong. To me, recognizing the civil service's unique character in trying to serve the public interest, trying to serve government of the day, and trying to uphold its own distinct values and ethics, the key challenge is trying to maintain a coherent, broadly shared, concrete sense of what its role is and how it can deliver on that role. And I think we can all do more to contribute to that, even by just building a more substantive public discourse on what the role of the civil service is or should be, and why that's important. The second thing I'd point to is that the civil service has not faced a significant cost for failing to modernize in the past. There's been no shortage of reform efforts to the civil service in Canada. One estimate suggests that between the 1960s and the 1990s, there was on average one new major push for reform every 3 to 5 years. But modernization has often been too modest in its goals, too timid in its implementation, and at times just an outright failure. There's been a lack of incentives to reform and a lack of consequences for failing to do so. And the third thing I would point to is the need for better balances. I think there are a variety of different objectives or virtues that civil service has to balance, and they often prevent paradoxes. For example, as the theme of the conference, how does the civil service make sure it's in a position to adapt, innovate, and fail in a way that ultimately leads to success, but also achieves objectives, short-term effectiveness, predictability, and fairness. So getting the balance right on these kinds of paradoxes is something that I don't think we're currently even close to, and I think we've got to do more to try to find what some of the balances that the civil service needs to strike. In terms of kind of dedicating a career, I think that sounds far more noble than anything that I've done to date. I've kind of basically ended up here by a series of very fortunate opportunities and experiences. But I guess what I would say is that what underlines me being here is that I believe that the state is incredibly important for good and for bad at times, but it is incredibly important in our lives, that a professional, well-functioning, nonpartisan civil service is integral to the operation of good governance. And as Amanda said earlier, we've all got a massive kind of interest in ensuring that we have a well-functioning civil service.
Okay. Is it alive? Yes. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I would say that there's a lot of good in public service today, but it's also an increasingly complex world that the public sector needs to also recognize. And we do have a lot of different interesting approaches and tools out there that, in my point of view, is an obligation for the public sector to take on and to explore by experimentation. Also, I think it was Einstein saying that if he had an hour, he would spend 55 minutes on the problem and 5 minutes on the solution. That's not something happening a lot in the public sector. We spend too little time exploring what the problem actually is, and this is why we pretty often end up solving the wrong problem, maybe with very good solutions, but then we find ourselves in the same place. The reason why I find it rewarding to work in civil service, and I've been doing so for many years, is because of the bottom lines. I mean, we have so complex bottom lines, and it's not only about efficiency and productivity, it's also about transparency, it's about democracy ultimately. So meeting all those, that can take a lifetime.
And, sorry, continue. Did you have more to add?
No, you were asking about examples, and
yeah, sure, that would be great.
I'm thinking what to say, because I mean, you can look to very specific examples as the one you mentioned, by actually helping specific teachers trying to solve a very concrete problem about time versus quality, and also spreading those experiences both to the ministry but also to other schools. That's very on-the-ground examples, but also we have been spending a lot of time looking into the actual policy process and how we move from central level delivering reform packages to the front level. We even call them that. We call them reform packages, like something to be delivered to front level, hoping for the best in implementation. So something that I'm very proud of is how we have been able to, still work in progress, but nevertheless been able to create a new process of policy making, actually looking to build in how we meet the intended political effects of reforms by thinking about implementation really early in the process, test really early, and makes central civil servants go to the field, go to the front level to see what's actually there already. Another problem with public sector today is that we tend to create policies for a thought ground zero, and that there's no such thing out there. We need to look at what's already there before actually putting pen to paper and writing up new national reforms.
Tina.
Vous m'entendez? Bonjour. Tout d'abord, merci de m'avoir invité. C'est un véritable plaisir d'être là et de pouvoir partager nos expériences dans le Royaume-Uni et ailleurs. I will switch to English as it is Saturday morning. So I would like to start by just perhaps disagreeing with the premise that the civil service is broken or somehow fundamentally flawed. I find that the people that comprise the civil service are some of the smartest and most hardworking individuals that I've met who face the very challenging task of trying to improve people's lives while often facing a lot of political pressure, working under incredibly tight timelines. So the reason I love working with policy and for policymakers and civil servants is because I find it incredibly meaningful. It's being able to apply my academic background in social psychology, behavioral economics, to things that make a real difference in people's lives. So I think the civil service has, again, echoing my colleagues, an incredibly important role. So a little bit about the Behavioral Insights team to understand what it is actually we sort of do. So as Amanda mentioned, we started life within the UK's Prime Minister's office in 2010, but we've since become a social purpose company. So we're partly owned by the government, but we function sort of outside of it, which allows us to work both with the central government and local government, as well as with governments abroad and organizations like the World Bank and UNDP. We basically kind of do two things, which I think are sort of a specific skill set within a civil service context. The first one is that we apply the latest research evidence from behavioral science, social psychology, to policy making and service design. To give a really concrete example, we know from psychology that people are prone to something called hyperbolic discounting. I'm sorry, that's a really academic-y, sort of jargony term, but it basically means that people will prefer having less sooner than more later. So that has a lot of implications for all kinds of policy issues. So think about health. I'm more likely to want to have my donut now than wait and be healthy or slim in 6 months' time. Huge implications for public health. Also, in terms of financial behavior, explains why some people fail to save sufficiently for older age. So having this information that comes from lab studies, etc., and then looking at how it plays out in the real world, and using that accurate understanding of human behavior and decision-making as a basis of policy-making. That's kind of the first thing. And I think a lot of that overlaps with what KID is doing as well. The second thing is, and I think, again, a lot of people in this room will have some stake in this, is measuring the effectiveness of the things we're doing. So rather than just say, oh, we've got this cool, wacky idea, let's implement it, or we've got this idea we think works, it worked elsewhere, actually measuring, well, how does it actually work? How much does it work? How much does it improve our outcomes? So we use randomized controlled trials, which are understood as the gold standard of evaluation as much as possible. So that I would say is sort of the two main things. If I have time, I will give one example.
Please do, yeah, it's great.
From sort of a recent trial that I'm personally very excited about and gives you sort of a flavor, again, of this approach to policymaking. So this was a piece we did with a local authority in England, the Avon and Somerset Constabulary, so it was with the police force, and their concern or their problem was that their police force was quite homogenous, it was mostly white, police officers, and that did not reflect the diversity in the community. So they wanted to find a way to increase the diversity within their police force. We started by doing sort of an ethnographic piece, so just as again Kate was saying, need to understand the problem before you can jump to the conclusions. So we're really looking at, how do people in the community feel about this, but also looking at some of the statistics and just data around, is it an issue that not enough people are applying? Or is it that from those minority groups? Or is it that actually they're applying but they fall out at some point in the process? And what we saw was that actually, in terms of application, there's a significant number of applications from the Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, but they seem to fall out at a specific point. And that point was when they were asked to do an online test on sort of situational judgment. And at that point, what we're seeing is that white applicants are scoring much higher than the minority applicants. And we sort of went to our cookbooks, did our piece of academic research, and came back and suggested a very simple message that would be given to the applicants right before they do the test. And the message asked them to think about the meaning of becoming a police officer for themselves and for their communities. Just a very short, take a few minutes to reflect on this, and then the next screen gives you the actual task. And what do we find? So this was a randomized controlled trial, so some applicants did not get the message. In the so-called treatment group, they did. For white applicants, asking them to reflect on the meaning had practically no difference. They scored equally well as without the message. For the Black and minority ethnic applicants, their average success rate went up from 40% to 60%, effectively reducing or removing the gap between the white and Black minority ethnic applicants. So I think it's a very new result. We're writing it up. But it's a powerful example of how a very small, practically costless intervention can help increase diversity in the workforce. I'll give more example as we go along. Thank you.
Great. So I think that was a wonderful way to start. We all have a sense of sort of why you come to this. And I think, it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, what's wrong with the public service. I think, Tina raises a really great point, and I found this in my own research, is when you meet with public servants, they are very passionate about what they do, and they do want to be effective and make a difference. At the same time, something that comes out in the work that you do, and I think a lot of the inspiration for the new wave of innovation is the idea that the governments have kind of been navel-gazing maybe for a while, and that in fact part of the problem with how we think about policies and deliver services is that it's very government-centric. And so citizen-centrism is one of the buzzwords that we hear about, and we've been hearing about it for a long time. But in particular, Kit, I wanted to ask, I've heard you speak before about how governments don't see like citizens. And so maybe if you can unpack that for us a little bit and discuss, when you go into a government organization with your colleagues and you're helping them to understand a problem in a new way, or maybe think about a better solution by giving them that citizen-centric view, how do you do that, in practice? And is there any resistance from bureaucrats who maybe have never been asked to think that way before?
Okay. Well, I guess that the main difference between our approach and a more traditional approach would be that we take a more holistic view on the problems, and that actually, we have so much knowledge already about citizens and about what they do. We have numbers, statistics, all the economic analysis. All those things are already in the system, so we do know a lot beforehand. But to supplement that, we are asking the why questions, and those questions are really important to know. Why are people actually acting how they're acting, and why is there sometimes a difference between what they actually do and what they say they do? That's where anthropology, ethnography comes into the picture, because we can actually both observe people in their own settings, and we can do ethnographic interviews, and then bring that knowledge back to the systems that we are working with as colleagues, which is part of also the answer to your second question. How do we work with people? We work with the ministries that we are part of as colleagues, and that also means that we do some kind of small-scale training in the projects by taking more traditional civil servants with us to do the field work, to meet the citizens, to do the observation studies. And as you imply, that can be almost scary the first times. Am I speaking to an actual citizen? Wow. But no, joking. Because I mean, I understand why it's scary. Because as many have already said, most civil servants go to work to do a good job every day. And when you go out there and ask people about their lives, you will sometimes be told that it's not good enough, or that people suffer from the services that you provide. And that's not a lot of fun, of course, and can be pretty overwhelming the first times. But once you understand that it's not a personal thing and it's actually helpful to become better, then that sort of goes away. Did I answer?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, I think that public servants in the room, that probably resonates with you. There's not a lot of opportunity to directly interact with citizens for many civil servants unless you're on the front line. And so this is a very new worldview to suddenly encounter. I mean, I guess that brings us to one of the words that titles this conference, but that's also at play in any discussion of innovation, which is failure. And I think, you know, there is the stereotype in government that there's no room for failure, and that's probably overblown, but it is also a real and legitimate issue, because the reality of the work of government is that it's public, and there are journalists who are waiting to get you for that mistake. And in a Westminster system where there is a minister at the top of the chain, you know, ultimately their name could be on the cover of the paper, and they could be asked to resign in an extreme case for a mistake that might have happened along the way. And so I guess on that note, I'll ask Mark, given that this is the context in which these new innovation processes need to take place, some argue that, you know, actually innovation is sort of completely at odds with what government is and how we structure it. Risk-averse organizations can't innovate because innovation demands scope for risk and potentially the failure that comes with that. So I guess I'll put that out there and ask you, is there any truth to that idea? Is it overblown? And if there is a kernel of truth at least, how can political leaders, the public, media commentators, and public servants themselves create scope for failure and, in turn, innovation in government?
I don't think it's overblown.
Okay, good.
Or
That's
or at
basically
least
the question.
or at least it's not. You know, perhaps it's somewhat overblown, but there is a kernel of truth. I recently had the chance to interview a former advisor to a prime minister, and I was somewhat taken aback, frankly, about how blunt he was in his assessment. And I'll just read you what he said. He said, "There is no risk tolerance in our society." I mean, really, politically, given our media culture, we have zero risk tolerance. No matter what happens, you're going to get paced over it. So the political side has zero risk tolerance, which suggests that the public service has to, and I don't know how to balance these things, figure out how to work in that framework. So I think, you know, I don't think it's cliche to say that lack of tolerance for risk or a very limited tolerance for risk and for failure informs the context in which the public service has to attempt to be able to adapt and innovate and at times fail. At the same time, I'd say it's plainly wrong to say governments do not innovate. For example, the work of both of my very impressive co-panelists make clear that's not the case. Around the world, there are local, regional, national government innovators who are drawing on kind of human-centered approaches to design, user engagement, open innovation, cross-sector collaboration, and better use of evidence and data to inform policy making and governing. So I think the question's about how we can expand the scope for fostering greater innovation, and I think this is going to sound simplistic because it is. I think the biggest thing on the political side is that leaders could simply make a decision to do things differently. Going back to that quote, that government did not have to decide that they had zero tolerance for risk. They could make a different decision. Now, at the same time, I think the bureaucracy could do more to support that kind of shift in thinking by helping the political side, by better explaining how they want to innovate, what the actual risks are, how best they think they can understand those risks, how they can mitigate the risks, and ensuring that there's a concrete system of accountability in place for when things actually do go wrong. And I don't think that's always been the case, and I think even when it is the case, it's often not well communicated outwardly from the public service. Innovation doesn't require a carte blanche, and nor should it get one. So I think the bureaucracy has a role in kind of helping politicians come along there too. And the public service should be able to explain that in a way that politicians and citizens fully understand it. Particularly when this involves models that include shifting either fully or partially service delivery and other elements of what governments do outside of the state. And this is often ignored in our enthusiasm for what are often kind of trendy new ways of doing business.
Okay. I think what you raised there is that, so from top-down leadership, we can create space for innovation and the failure that might come with that, and that's an important, sort of condition for these kinds of initiatives to flourish. I think part of it was also, part of the conditions were also pointed to in Kit's opening introduction, in which she noted that, part of it is getting government to spend more time unpacking the problem. And so actually last night at the dinner that we had, in which Kit sort of shared her experience and the journey that MindLab has gone on, in conversation with Nick Charney, who's at a table over there, who is a federal public servant, he was talking about the difference between thinking fast and thinking slow. And it occurs to me that actually a lot of these processes are trying to ask governments to slow down a little bit and maybe be a bit more thoughtful about understanding the problems that we're facing and developing solutions. At the same time, there is often political or very real practical reasons why governments need to move fast, because services need to be delivered, or sometimes there's a crisis. I mean, right now our government's trying to figure out how to bring 25,000 refugees to Canada. So I wonder if both Kit and Tina could comment a little bit on, when you enter a department and your approach is about, really thoughtfully thinking about a research design, who needs to be involved, listening, how do you bring that slow pace of thinking to an organization that might be facing very real demands to move quick and get something out there?
Okay, but I would like to comment on that, but also on the risk topic.
Please do, yeah.
Because risk it's actually a funny topic when we're talking public sector. Public sector and civil servants take risks every day. Every day we take risks. We just tend to take risks that we know or think we know what will mean. And that's not often spoken about when we talk about risk. Another element of this discussion is around, the lab discussion or any alternative approach to traditional approaches. Is that not more risky than the traditional ones? And I would say what Tina does and what we do at MindLab is basically offering a contained space to test the risks. Which is so much better than doing it by rolling it out over the entire country without testing it first. That was on the risk. The other thing you ask is on how do we kind of sell the approach to the people that we are going to work with. Well, I would say it has become easier over the years, because in the beginning of MindLab's time as service designers, we needed to explain a lot more than we do today what the approach means. What does it mean to do qualitative research? How valid is it compared to the numbers and statistics, stuff like that. But as it has become more common, not only with us, but globally, this is less and less needed. But the way that people really learn it is by trying it out and you know, feeling that they actually enrich their projects, enrich their results, and feel that they stand on better ground when they create new solutions. So it's learning by doing most of the time.
Yeah, so how to introduce these new ways of working. I think much like MindLab, we also faced a certain degree of skepticism at the beginning, but really the results quite quickly started to speak for themselves. So we started in 2010. Today we've run about 200 randomized controlled trials. So we now have a body of evidence where we can show that these things work. So it's been, you know, it's a lot easier now, and also the methods are becoming a lot more mainstream. So a lot of government departments in the UK now have their own behavioral insights units that we collaborate with or provide additional support to when needed. So it evolves with time. I think initially when you're starting to do this, it's really important to be humble, because I'm an academic social psychologist. Before I started working for the Behavioral Insights team, I didn't know that much about government or about the civil service. So it was very important for me to come in understanding that some of the people I was trying to help had been working in a specific policy area for 30 years. So there's no way I could even pretend to know more about it than they did. So it's learning as fast as you can from the people you're working with and really working together, rather than sort of saying, oh, we're these, you know, cool people with all these innovative ideas and we're going to come in and we're going to solve your problems. Like, that's just not how it works. So it needs to be collaborative, fundamentally. I think the other bit that's important is to really understand what matters to public officials. So again, we have a lot of incredibly talented people joining us from top-notch universities to come and work on our projects. And what's really important is that they work alongside people who have an authentic and deep understanding of government and government priorities and the sort of pressured environment that governments sometimes work in. I had a quick comment on the risk, and then a quick comment on what do you do when you don't have time to trial. On the risk stuff, the way we try and work is always to run a smaller pilot first, see does this work, so you can fail small, and then if it does look like it works, then you can run it on a bigger scale. So some work we did with employment offices, we started running a pilot just with one job center, so it's employment office, I'm not sure what the Canadian equivalent would be, but where people who are out of work need to go report weekly to get some coaching to get back to work. And we tested a new approach in one center, it seemed to work, and then we rolled it out within the county, so including 20 job centers. And once we had those results, actually we were hoping to have those results and then the ministers could roll it out nationally. They decided to do so while we were waiting for those results from the larger trial. I'm sure some of you have experience with this. But the point was, when you take this sort of gradual approach, it doesn't matter if you don't get the results you want from the first one, because it was a pilot anyways. So that's sort of a way to introduce these new ways that you're actually showing that it helps you avoid risk because you're testing small. On this sort of point around if you don't have time to trial, we're actually doing a very exciting trial at the moment. It's probably, in terms of funds, it's the largest trial we've done. So the government's committed £20 million to look at innovative ways to deliver business advice to small companies. So it's helping SMEs to grow faster. And so we were asked to work on this by the Treasury and the Department for Business. And they wanted to roll the scheme out as soon as possible. So what we suggested was that let's embed some learning into the process, the way we roll it out. So we rolled it out as an RCT running until 2017, in which we randomly allocate businesses to receive different kinds of advice and in different ways. So a business says, I want some business advice. They enroll in the scheme. We first determine whether they're eligible. And then after that, we vary whether they get the advice or not. We vary whether they get it online or face-to-face. And then we also vary the types of advice they get, so whether it's marketing related or leadership related, etc. And at the end of, hopefully by around 2017, we'll have results concrete evidence on what kinds of advice helps increase business performance. So here we didn't have a trial first, but at least we know that we're going to learn from the process itself.
So we've got a lot of ideas out there, and I think there's many more questions that flow from what we've discussed. I think at this stage I'm actually going to open it out and invite anybody really from the audience who has a burning question. I think there's a microphone that's going to be passed around. It's just at the back. I have a gentleman up here who has his hand up. And I just ask you all to please introduce yourself and give your title or where you're coming at this topic from. In particular for our international guests who might not know who you are and what you do. And also, just to echo Jennifer, we do want to try to get some more scholars out there. So please don't be shy.
Marc Renaud, Institut universitaire de Lisbonne. Je serais très curieux de savoir comment vous vous y prenez pour faire des RCT dans le secteur public et comment vous réussissez à vous faire accepter.
I'll respond in English if that's okay. So usually, we work on sort of two kinds of projects. So either on Cabinet Office priorities, so that's the equivalent of PCO here, or different departments will come to us, or local authorities will come to us saying, we've got this behavior we would like to change, or this policy challenge, can you help us work with it? And usually from the outset we say, we are about testing and finding out what works. We're not about sort of coming up with fancy advice and then just sort of crossing our fingers and hope it'll work. So I think when government departments come to us, they know that it will involve some trialing. Usually that's sort of agreed at the start. After that, it's usually we will design the trial, or we will design it together with the civil servants, and then we'll help with the implementation. So in the example of the employment offices, we spent weeks and weeks training staff on site, so job coaches, training them to deliver a slightly different kind of approach. And then usually government departments themselves will do the data analysis, the evaluation. I think it's just good practice not to have the same person implement the trial and also find whether it worked or not. I don't know if that answers your question. I would say yes, yeah. Sometimes there is a rush to get results. You may not be able to run the trial for as long as you would like to. So if it's helping, for example, marginalized people with complex issues who are out of work, supporting them back to work will take time. But if you only have 6 months to run a trial, you may not be able to measure the outcomes, so actual employment outcomes that you would like to. So you need to compromise. You need to find also what the department needs and what works for them.
Great, thank you very much. Please.
Sven Yershevsky. I worked 37 years in foreign affairs, mostly in intelligence operations in the field and at headquarters. When I joined, it was the age of mandarins, which I think very few people in this room remember, and it was innovative, and that's all gone. The department I joined had 4,000 people, and in spite of cutbacks, it now has 9,000. I wonder how that happened. There's no room for failure. Well, no, not really. There's no room for success. To get innovative things off the ground in given current process rigidities and how decisions are made is almost impossible. And that's a function of how departments are managed. I do want to say that it's not one size fits all. A policy shop like foreign affairs is very different. It needs a different culture and a different approach from one that delivers pension checks on time, or deals with unemployed people, or deals with health. They're all very different. One size does not fit all. Right now, government systems are government-wide. The result is a homogenization, which is destructive of creativity and innovation. Personnel management systems are incredibly rigid in a time of terrific change, where you need to be very flexible. It takes 1 year to hire someone. It takes 1 year to change position grade. This adds to costs very often, significantly. The reward system is unrelated to accomplishment or innovation. Competence-based management does not measure either of those. People makes for, frankly, favoritism and nepotism in promotion systems. Decline of expertise. I had 9 postings. I have a lot of experience about the world. Junior officer in the department now can expect in a 30-year career 2 postings. If he's lucky, 3. A manager, because we have the universal EX, of 1-year experience cannot be expected to be courageous in policy formation or innovation. What I'm saying here is we got to bring it down to the weeds. We got to look at how departments are actually run and whether those ways, those methods, are in conformity with what the government wants or they act against it. I would argue we try to develop some innovative forms of intelligence collection abroad. The problems were incredible, and when we retired, the program was canceled, in spite of the fact it was a significant success and much admired by our Five Eyes allies. We need to look at culture. We have to lead how we are managed. We need to look at why people no longer take ownership of the departments they're part of. Some of the best and brightest people in the department, my department, are leaving. And they're leaving because they can't express their creativity, and that's a tragedy. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that resonated with a fair number of people here, and actually I think points to an interesting distinction between maybe some of what we've been talking about are very sort of specific, acute challenges, service design issues or policy issues, whereas there's also this more macro question about how we structure and manage in a public organization. And so maybe some of the questions come out today will relate to that. I mean, I don't know, Mark, if you wanted to comment a bit, because you do know, you're probably most familiar with how public management currently happens in Ottawa, and can speak to some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think I just echo exactly what you just said. I think there is a mix of, and I agree. I mean, there's issues here that operate at a macro level, and again, I would go back to that kind of at the level of trying to understand what we want the public service to do and how to do it. But there are also tons of issues in the weeds here, process issues like you raised around human resources, performance, accountability, frankly. I mean, I think one of the big challenges here is that we've never really gotten, I mean, the new public management stuff was all about give managers more space and heighten accountability. I don't think we ever really gave managers that much more space, nor did we give them heightened accountability. So I think, you know, there's a need to balance both what's in the weeds and at a macro level.
Can I comment?
Yeah, please, Kit.
I completely agree that one size doesn't fit all, and I think that's part of the reason why we are here, because we represent the notion that we should actually try and take on different approaches to our service and policy making. About the systemic change that is needed, I guess one of the experiences that I have learned over the last 9 years with MindLab is that the systemic change very often comes from the solutions. So when we have come up with a new solution, it very often turns out that that has an impact on the system and on how we should work. And that's basically our biggest risk, is that we don't do that we don't follow up on that and also implement those systemic changes. I would say it's striking how experts around the globe within different fields actually know each other, have networks, draw upon each other to do different assignments, tasks, use each other a lot. And that's one of the challenges that we face also locally in public sector. How do we identify the people with the creativity? How do we match the right people with the right problems and the right approaches with the right problems? And that's something that we should at least start a discussion about. How do we create those networks so it becomes like a global approach to the. We face the same problems all over the world. We should use each other much more, and not only within little nerdish expert groups, but in the entire public service. So I don't have the answer as to how we are doing this, but this is certainly a discussion we should start right now. How we create those networks of not innovators, but people who see this and want to do something to change the systems that we are part of for the better.
Okay, so I see a few
I have
questions.
the mic, actually.
You have the mic, so you get to go. That's how it works.
My name is Melanie Doucette. I'm a 2014 Trudeau Scholar. I'm doing my PhD right now in social work at McGill University, and my area of expertise is youth aging out of the foster care system. And I guess I'm looking at this government reform challenge from a variety of perspectives, not only as a scholar. I am ex-civil servant. I worked for government in New Brunswick for 6 years before deciding to pursue my PhD. And I worked on a project, a pilot project actually, called Integrated Service Delivery, which was basically to eliminate silos and integrate child and youth serving departments to try and better address the needs of at-risk children and youth. I'm also a former youth care worker. So I worked in group homes, closed and open. So I have that perspective of being at the front line. And I'm also a former foster care child, so I'm also a former client. So I have all these different perspectives when I'm looking at how government works and how it could possibly be improved. I think that government reform obviously needs to happen, and it needs to be based on evidence and best practices, which are already out there. It's not like we're starting from scratch. I think that we already have evidence that things aren't working in terms of operating in silos. We have a lot of evidence of that in terms of worst case scenarios that have happened one too many times where children and youth have died. For example, the Ashley Smith case, the Integrated Service Delivery Project in New Brunswick was a direct response to that case. Because what happened is she fell through the cracks due to systems of inefficiencies to address her mental health needs. And another example would be a former youth in care in British Columbia who committed suicide 2 days after aging out because she was homeless and didn't have anywhere to go. And that was a legislative inefficiency where usually at the age of majority you age out and you don't have many supports available to you if you were a foster kid and were never adopted. So I think that system failures and the way it's operating right now in terms of silos is letting down our most vulnerable. And it's not that we don't have civil servants that are very passionate and very caring about these issues. We do. I think it's about the way that the systems are operated. We need a change not only in bureaucratic structures to increase efficiency and expediency in addressing those issues at all levels, the policy level, program level, and intervention level, but I think we also need a fundamental change in ideologies and culture within government. From operating in silos, so this whole notion of independent departments working in their own specializations and not working together at the same table, to interdependence, which I completely agree with this whole notion of interconnectedness and interdependence and integration of expertise and efforts. But that comes with the ability to share power, to be able to sit at the table and recognize everyone's expertise and to be able to share that together. And another component that I think is important to mention is also sharing that power with clients and former clients and treating them as valuable experts in their field in terms of being able to inform how we better the services and policies and programs that are targeted to them. So instead of doing things to them, for them, we do things with them. And I think that is something that should be looked at when looking at government reform and improvement. Thank you.
I don't know if anybody wanted to jump in and comment back on that. I think what you're getting at really is, again, we've been talking a bit about maybe goals that we can all agree on. So a randomized controlled trial that allows us to reduce wait times or ensure it's easier for you to pay your taxes on time is kind of a no-brainer. But there are also policy issues that are much more sticky, much more value-laden, your perspective of what a good outcome would be is a product of your worldview and the communities of which you're a part. So maybe I'll put that to you and ask how the public sector innovation can be a vehicle for more collaborative models of policy making and for helping us as a society to contribute to policy making processes in those very sticky, value-laden areas in which a good outcome is not going to be something that 100% of the population agrees on.
I think the question of why do we not see more integrated service delivery is a really interesting and good one. There's probably several components behind it. One is political will and decisions to make some difficult changes, but there's also, and I'm again looking at things from a sort of individual behavior perspective, is building in ways to reduce resistance to change. So people have been working in existing ways for a very long time, so how do we make that change more acceptable? There's also something about making sure that it's easy for people to collaborate. The more actors you put in to a picture, the harder it gets to know who's responsible for what. And I think especially when it comes to things like children's services or foster care, where people are having to make really difficult decisions, often very fast, it needs to be really crystal clear who has the responsibility to make the call, to decide what's going to be done. So I think when the more actors we have, we just need to be really, really clear whose responsibility it is to make a decision. So I think there's definitely ways in which we can work together to get towards there. But yeah, someone needs to start.
I guess that it's also not only a matter of sharing power, but also sharing a lot more knowledge, as well as remembering the meaning, infusing the meaning again into what we are here to do. What's the meaning of working in the civil service? That's what you asked in the beginning. That's a really important question for everyone working in the public sector. Why are we here and what's our ultimate goal? And sometimes that meanings, we lose sight of that meaning within the institutions. And it's, I think that the collaboration between different institutions, within agencies, between agencies, breaking down silos, helps us re-infuse that meaning into the work that we do. Maybe it's a little abstract, but I think it's really important to come back to a place where we are actually learning organizations and have an institutional memory that we share.
The only thing I would add is to pick up on the notion that politics is, frankly, often about value-laden trade-offs. And innovation, improving innovation, adaptation, measuring, and sharing knowledge are all very important, and we can do a lot better on those scores. But often it is about value-laden trade-offs, and the solution to the technocracy won't eliminate that reality at the end of the day. So we do always have to be cognizant of power, I think, and some of the fact that not all of these questions are always going to be resolved by different kind of innovative approaches.
I see a hand at the back, and you've got the microphone.
I have a microphone.
Great. You're doing all the work for me. Great.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Pierce. I'm a 2015 scholar with the Trudeau Foundation. I'd like to ask the panel a question about the role of funding in this discussion and public sector funding, particularly given that in Canada there's less private philanthropy than there is in other countries, and the public sector funds a lot of the nonprofit sector in this country. We heard yesterday about lots of different experiments and innovations in the nonprofit sector, but we also, I think, well know in this room that there's caution and hesitancy that comes from a fear of biting the hand that feeds you, so to speak. So if you could speak to that dynamic and how the funding structures of government can improve innovation in the nonprofit sector as well as within government. And then just a related question, the role of evaluation in that. There's a lot of pressure and interesting developments in terms of integrating more RCT-based evaluation approaches. At the same time, that's an expensive and sort of narrow approach to defining outcomes, and sometimes it can be quite a burden on implementing organizations, and sometimes it can miss some of the more system level or political change kind of outcomes. So if you could maybe speak to how we could develop some different and more creative evaluation approaches to that end. Thanks.
So the state enabling innovation outside. Would anybody like to speak to that first? Maybe bringing experiences from abroad and how your governments are working with the nonprofit sector. Or Mark can just talk about how CRA loves to audit our nonprofits. That's another talk we can have.
I'm not an expert on this, but as far as I know of, Scandinavia may be one of the areas of the world where government has a lot of the same obligations taken on them that NGOs do in other parts of the world. We have quite a large state. As for the evaluation part, it's a really tricky question where I'm actually pretty envious on the behavioral insights people, because they do all these control trials and then they have actually baselines and numbers that they can present fairly quickly. Sometimes in larger policy programs that can be harder to do, but I've found it to be really important to try and establish that baseline. And I know that many people in the public sector speak about this. We talk a lot about the measurement and evaluation part, but very few have found the key to actually do it right without overburdening the system with indicators that are not really important. So I've become more and more pragmatic on this over the years, and we really need to set up indicators that are actually meaningful to an evaluation, which means it's a part of defining the right problem to me, to establish that baseline that you can actually measure on after.
Yeah, maybe just to pick on the evaluation point as well. I would say I agree that RCTs give you a certain side of the picture. I wouldn't necessarily agree with them always being very sort of expensive and burdensome to implement. As much as possible, what does make your life a lot easier is if you can use existing MI data. So if the measurements are already there, you're not asking staff to collect any additional data. So all you're really doing is randomly allocating people to the program and you can use designs where you make sure that everybody does get the program at some point. So I think, to me, the cost of not evaluating it is bigger than actually evaluating it. At the same time, I think things like qualitative information, surveys, other kinds of sort of getting at the experience of the service or of the policy is also incredibly important. So I wouldn't say RCTs sort of alone are enough, but as much as you can triangulate and have different sources of evaluation. But then when you can't do an RCT, you can do quasi-experiments or propensity score matching or other fun things where you're, again, using sort of available data. So I think we can be creative and building the knowledge to do that.
basically agree with everything my two colleagues have said about on the evaluation side. The one thing that's kind of tangential, but I'd want to pick up a little bit here, and it relates to the broader conversation we've been having, is there's also embedded in there a conversation about what roles groups outside government can play in terms of service delivery, innovation, and things like this. And we haven't had as much experimentation with different forms and service delivery approaches in Canada as some other places have, but I'd kind of also want to raise some caution here too. While many of these approaches are exciting and they show a great deal of potential, in many cases we also don't have a great deal of evidence about their effectiveness or their unintended consequences of different organizational approaches, and we often ignore considerations like accountability, power, representation, and kind of implications for hollowing out of state capacity as well. And it seems to me those kind of questions deserve a lot more attention in this kind of conversation too.
I have a comment also. I just remember one of the very first projects that we did at MindLab was around burden hunt for companies, for businesses, red tape for businesses. And the project started out because we could tell that from numbers and statistics that we had actually managed to reduce the number of burdens on companies, but yet they kept saying that they felt there was more. And that was when the qualitative approach actually became meaningful to me, because when we asked them about this, it turned out that it wasn't about the number of burdens or the time spent on burdens, which was what we were measuring on. It was about how much meaning did it make for these companies to do that specific form, to fill that specific form in. Did it fit with what the company had of procedures already? Stuff like this. So it was about meaning and not what we measured on time spent and number of burdens. And that's pretty interesting, because sometimes I think that, we need to walk that extra mile to actually understand what we should look for when we measure and evaluate.
I know there are still hands up with questions. We're actually at the end of the session now. Time flew because there was a lot to discuss, but there will be an opportunity to approach the panelists after to ask your questions, and I hope these conversations keep going. I really want to extend a huge thank you to our panelists for joining us today. As I began with, this is a very hot topic in Canada right now. We're at a crossroads. There's evidence from abroad that there's hope for innovation in the public service. This can be done, and the institution in many ways is well set up for it, in that we have the very important first step of public servants that are willing and in many cases able to actually do this. So thank you especially to Tina and Kip for bringing us your perspective from innovations that are really showing how the public service can do a better job. And thank you as well to Mark for setting the stage for us and really bringing home some of these issues to topics and challenges that we're all facing right now in Canada. Thank you as well to the audience for excellent questions and for thoughtfully considering the ideas before you. I began with a challenge to really say that for those of you who are in the public service, yes, of course, you live and breathe these issues every day. But for those of you that aren't, I think Mark raised a really great point. What do we want our public service to do? What is the role of the civil service in Canadian society and Canadian democracy? Maybe we haven't been having enough of that kind of conversation in Canada, and we can do our part as citizens by demanding more, being open to experimentation, to a slower policy process, a more thoughtful policy process, and we can ask our governments to do the kinds of things we see Tina and Kit doing for other governments. So the challenge is really out there. And I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this session and found it useful.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks very much to this wonderful panel. The Trudeau Foundation scholars and fellows come from every possible discipline: history, anthropology, law, and so forth. And I'm really struck by the elements that you mentioned here, with respect to the public service, are going to apply to their work. So, measuring the right things, making sure that you're measuring the right things, going to the source to make sure that, your measurements are the ones that are going to be useful to them. The use of instruments from different disciplines, so randomized controlled trials, I'm sure that didn't start in the social sciences, you're using it in the social sciences. So thank you very much, I really appreciate that.